So this is very much in dispute. You've got one side saying, yes, Mr. Trump deserves a Nobel. The other side saying the Americans had nothing to do with this. And then you saw Mr. Trump's ire.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end. The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip. We'll own it. Know that China is doing very poorly right now. I just saw some reports coming out, and I don't want that to happen to China. You're gambling with World War III. I was saved by God to make America great again.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battlelines. It's Friday, the 22nd of August, 2025. Donald Trump likes to call himself a peace president, one who ends wars rather than starting them. So far, it's true he has not yet stopped either the war in Gaza or that in Ukraine, but nor has he much time for critics or backseat drivers. I've settled 6 wars in 6 months, one of them a possible nuclear disaster, he wrote on Truth Social this week. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I don't need the advice of people who have been working on all of these conflicts for years and were never able to do a thing to stop them. It's no secret that one of Mr. Trump's reasons for wanting to end the war is his ambition to win a Nobel Peace Prize. That is, I think we can agree, an honourable ambition. But which conflicts is he talking about? Does his claim to have settled any of them stand up to scrutiny? And if he has, does he deserve a medal for it? I turn to Adrian Blomfield, our senior foreign correspondent, to explain which conflicts we're talking about and what you have to do to get the Nobel Prize.
I think we have to look at them on a case-by-case basis. Going back to the point that you were making, I think he has said quite a lot in public that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, fairly recently, there were reports that he had actually called the Norwegian finance minister to say that he wanted one if he settled the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So it's very clear, and world leaders who are involved in these disputes or semi-disputes have been lining up to nominate him. Benjamin Netanyahu nominated him. The Pakistanis have nominated him. The Armenians and the Azeris have nominated him. So they all know what to do. And if you don't nominate him, you can get into terrible trouble, as Narendra Modi has found. So maybe we'll be discussing that. There are 6, possibly 7 conflicts that we're talking about here that he's claiming credit for. We've got Rwanda-Congo. We've got Ethiopia-Egypt, which is an unusual one. We'll be coming to that. We've got Armenia-Azerbaijan. We've got Cambodia-Thailand. We've got Israel-Iran. This blitzkrieg of peace.
Serbia and Kosovo.
Serbia and Kosovo is not one actually that the White House put out when questioned about this, but it's something that Mr. Trump has alluded to because there was an economic deal between Serbia and Kosovo that he worked on in his first term. I think that's caused some perplexity in the region, although Kosovo has said that he has been working behind the scenes in this particular second period in office. But I think, we have to look at what Nobel Prizes are traditionally given for, and that is at the end of a peace process rather than at the beginning. And, I think you see a lot of these kind of photo opportunities. I was listening to a former US ambassador to Kinshasa recently who said, a press conference is not the same thing as a peace deal, and there seems to be a conflation. There are areas in which Mr. Trump, who does seem to be determined, blessed are the peacemakers. He said that he was joking. He deserves to go to heaven for all his peacemaking activities. But a lot of them are still very much early in the process, rather than nearing resolution. And perhaps we should also look at the fact that Nobel Prizes in history don't tend to go to the mediators. So if you look at historically, for example, the Camp David Accords, you had Begin and Sadat won those in 1978. Jimmy Carter didn't. And he was very instrumental. He kept them going for a long time at Camp David until he got the breakthrough. James Baker tirelessly worked for the Madrid process that kick-started the Palestinian-Israeli reconciliation that led to Oslo in 1991. didn't get it. And then, indeed, the architects of Oslo, two Norwegian diplomats, Terje Rod-Larsen and Monica Juul, I think it was, were the two who drove that. But it was Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres, and Yitzhak Rabin who won it. So it's possible that some of these conflicts, which Mr. Trump is mediating, could result in a Nobel Prize. Maybe Nikol Pashinyan, the Armenian leader, and Ilham Aliyev in Azerbaijan might end up winning a prize, although Aliyev would be quite a controversial choice because he is a strong man. But traditionally, this is not the kind of thing that you would be awarded a Nobel Prize for. There is the exception, of course, of President Obama, and I think that's the root cause. Obama won one. Mr. Trump wants one too.
And Obama's choice was also controversial for exactly the reason you're giving there.
Yes, indeed. There have been controversial choices over the years. So the most recent one, Abiy Ahmed, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, for ending conflict with Eritrea. But then, of course, he got involved in a very nasty civil war with Tigrayan rebels. Barack Obama, it is still very unclear what he won that for, apart from being a very nice chap. And so you can see a little bit of the anger that would have caused on the other side of the aisle. Perhaps there is a similarity of sorts. And, if we look at Israel-Iran, Henry Kissinger, of course, won the Nobel Prize in 1973, I think it was, with Lê Duc Thu, who was the Vietnamese negotiator, and Kissinger was seen as he was obviously part of that war, and that led to a ceasefire deal that didn't work, and there was 2 years of war that followed before the fall of Saigon. And there are some similarities between that, because a ceasefire deal has been agreed between Israel and Iran in a war that the US participated with. So Mr. Trump can take credit for that. But the Paris Accords that resulted in that ceasefire deal that failed in 1973 in Vietnam were a result of 4 years of painstaking diplomacy, whereas, of course, this conflict between Israel and Iran was 12 days, and the US involvement was a single day.
Well, let's take these conflicts one by one, in no particular order, but the one that kind of is seared into my consciousness as a newsman most recently. Israel and Iran. Tell us about that, and tell us about whether or not Donald Trump was as instrumental in ending it as he says.
I think there's no question that he played an instrumental role in ending it because of the US attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. So it might have dragged on a lot longer had he not authorized that bombardment. Although, to be honest, I don't think it's not something that could have gone on for too long. I think we were talking about a 30-day frame, because Israel couldn't have gone and fought a war over that distance for too long. So it was always going to be a limited war. But of course, we only have a ceasefire there. The underlying issues remain. I've seen one of the arguments being made is that I read an op-ed, I think it was in USA Today, by what is presumably a woman who's presumably a Trump supporter, saying that he has kept the world safe from nuclear weapons because he's ended the nuclear threat from Iran. And last year, Nihon Hidankyo, I think I've said that right, from Japan, one of the survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who has spent, the organization has spent years advocating for denuclearization. So Trump has done the same thing and therefore deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. And of course, again, like with many of these things, it's rather premature because we don't know yet the extent of the damage to Iran's nuclear program and what Iran will do in the future. So perhaps it's something that could be considered down the line, but I think Mr. Trump is angling for a Nobel Prize as soon as possible, and I'd be surprised if he gets one for that.
Okay, I'm going to mark that for half a point then. Next, I said in no particular order, but Africa is it's a place you're very familiar with, where you've spent most of your career. correct me if I'm wrong, Adrian, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, which dramatically invaded eastern Congo. I'm forgetting when exactly now.
Depends which time you're talking about. There have been quite a lot since 1996, and Rwanda has had proxy troops. So there's been the latest rebellion, and not for the first time, but the M23 rebels started in 2021. But there was an escalation involving Rwandan troops on the ground that led to the fall of the two main cities in eastern Congo, Goma and Bukavu, in January. And I was in those rebel-held cities, in fact, in April. So, in some ways, there has been very serious US work on the ground to move that process forward. And I know US diplomats there have been very happy to continue doing the kind of work that they've always tried to do, push this process forward, and have been given the cover by Mr. Trump's ambition for a Nobel Prize. So it's given them some kind of impetus. I mean, to say that this was just a Trump process, because it was underway under Biden, and its career diplomats, and their life has been made much harder because of the swinging cuts to personnel in the State Department and the National Security Council. So there's a lot less expertise on the ground than there used to be. But Mr. Trump is prepared to use a cudgel in a way that other leaders haven't. So there were threats against Rwanda that didn't happen under the Biden administration to play ball, because Rwanda is seen as the aggressor. There are complicated reasons for this, dating back to that terrible genocide in 1994. The perpetrators of that genocide, the remnants, still potentially pose a threat, and they are in eastern Congo. But he was prepared to use the sort of threat of serious economic consequences against Rwanda, which other leaders wouldn't have done, because Rwanda is a key Western ally in Africa. And he's also dangled this deal. So he has a minerals deal, and he's also trying to buy in both Rwanda and Congo, tie them into investments. So I was at the Rubaya tantalum mine, which is a sort of key critical mineral. So there are critical minerals there that the US is interested in. Those minerals are conflict minerals because they've helped drive the conflict. Rwanda has smuggled out a lot of those, much more gold than actual minerals at the core of this. But there is a potential to buy everyone in. But it's very, very early stages. And again, there's too much that looks like the photo opportunity. So I think, we saw Olivier Nduhungirehe, the Rwandan foreign minister, and today's Kai Kwamba-Wagner, who is the Congolese foreign minister, at a photo opportunity for the signing of a preliminary deal at the White House. Now, you wouldn't normally see that kind. I think they would have been rather surprised to be having their photograph taken, but Mr. Trump wanted the credit for that. If you look back to the Oslo Accords, that famous picture with Clinton at the White House in 1993 for the Oslo Accords, that was the end of the process. There weren't photo opportunities at the very beginning of the process. So it seems like credit is being claimed for something very much in its early stages. We don't know if there's genuine goodwill. There's so many underlying causes, from land, refugees, how are you going to disarm rebels? There are 120 different rebel movements in eastern Congo. None of this has been addressed.
Tell us, what is the current state of play around Goma in that area? Is conflict ongoing?
Well, this is the thing. So not much has changed. So Rwanda is committed to withdrawing its troops, although they were already much less visible because its proxy rebels are there on the ground. They control a lot of the territory. The front lines have stopped. So the rebel advance has stopped thanks to American intervention around a place called Walikale. Diplomatic, not military intervention, obviously, but not much has changed on the ground. And since the signing of that preliminary framework deal, you've had continued massacres. So last month, M23 were accused of massacring 140 farmers in Rutshuru, north of Goma. And those two cities are still under occupation. There is a parallel negotiation happening in Qatar to look at M23. But at the moment, we have not seen any significant changes on the ground as a result of this. So for Mr. Trump to say that he has brought peace to the Congo is slightly tendentious.
Slightly tendentious. It sounds like he has slowed it.
Yes, there are US diplomats. They're building on processes that existed on the ground, the Nairobi process, the Luanda process. There has been impressive work. It could be much worse than it was. It looked like the rebels could sweep towards Kinshasa. That has not happened. So yes, on the positive corner, Mr. Trump's intervention has, you're quite right, slowed it. But there's an awful lot of spade work still to do.
Staying in Africa, this is a slightly strange one, and it's not one that I expected to see. Egypt and Ethiopia, who do not even share a border, but they do share a river. Tell us about the nascent Egypt-Ethiopia war that Mr. Trump claims to have stopped.
I mean, there certainly has been the risk of war. So the crux of the dispute is the Grand Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia is building on the Blue Nile. So Ethiopia sits in the upper reaches of the Nile. Of course, you've got the Blue Nile and the White Nile, which converge in Khartoum and then flow north downriver through Egypt. Egypt is known as the gift of the Nile. It gets 97% of its water from the Nile. The traditional flooding of the Nile, which no longer happens since the building of the Aswan Dam, allowed the civilization of Egypt to grow. So it's thousands of years since the Nile became regulated and it was incredibly predictable. So Egypt is very, very vulnerable to whatever happens upstream. And 75% of the waters that go through Egypt come from the Blue Nile. So there is understandable anxiety. Ethiopia, 60% of its population doesn't have electricity. By damming the upper waters of the Blue Nile, which flows heavily, as I said, would answer a lot of those problems and potentially benefit neighbouring Sudan as well. But Egypt has long been opposed. And in Mr. Trump's first term, he was very close and still is very close with Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the Egyptian strongman. So he tried to mediate in that, but it didn't go down well with the Ethiopians because he very much took Mr. Sisi's side. So it wasn't really mediation. I mean, he appeared to encourage President Sisi to bomb the dam, which, that's not necessarily your classic Nobel Prize winning mediation approach. It's slightly gone into abeyance, this question. Of course, as I mentioned before, there's been a civil war in Ethiopia, which has also been partially settled, although the country remains very, very volatile. The dam has now finally been built. It's taken since 2011. And I think this issue has come to the fore because it was actually completed last month. A lot of the initial concerns have been addressed because Egypt was very concerned as the dam was being filled, which took 4 years, that would affect waters downstream, and it didn't. But the key question here is what happens during bad droughts. Will Ethiopia continue to allow waters to flow through to Egypt? Ethiopia was excluded from the original colonial treaties on the Nile waters and is very bitter about that. So there are issues, and it could cause conflict in the future if Ethiopia were to restrict the flow of water during bad years. But I fail to see what Mr. Trump has done on this. I mean, apart from the threats to bomb the dam, there was this attempt in his first term. Ethiopia and Sudan left the negotiations. Nothing was signed. Nothing was achieved. Mr. Trump also seems to believe, as far as I can see, entirely wrongly, that the US paid for the dam, $4 billion, but none of it came. It was entirely domestically funded through bonds, taxes, and so on, built by an Italian company. I think there was some Chinese involvement in the construction as well. So, I mean, that's a very mysterious one. I mean, I think that's
strange. Unless something's been happening behind the scenes we don't know about. There's no visible Donald Trump involvement in mediation here.
It's difficult to see, given the positions that he's taken in the past, that Donald Trump could be perceived as an honest broker because he's very, very close to Sisi. He's seen as on the side of one of the two antagonists in this dispute.
Okay, I'm going to put a line through that one then because it doesn't sound like he's actually been doing much mediation at all in this term. Lastly from you, Adrian, India and Pakistan went to war again relatively recently. This is on the list of disputes that Donald Trump or the White House is claiming credit for ending. Did he have a role
This is very difficult to see because there's a huge dispute here, and it's very interesting to see the diplomatic fallout and how much this means for Mr. Trump. So yes, you have these 4 days of conflict. It's not been for the first time. There was certainly a lot of behind-the-scenes mediation and diplomacy going on. 36 countries, I think, were involved in all of that. And there is a dispute about why the ceasefire came about. Now, arguably, India had done what it wanted to do, although not particularly convincingly. It was perhaps something of a strategic end goal. Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance were certainly involved in talking to the two sides, and it is a very dangerous region because these are two nuclear powers. So we don't exactly know. The Pakistanis have played a diplomatic blinder with Mr. Trump. They immediately nominated him from the Nobel and gave him the credit for the ceasefire. India said this was entirely done at a bilateral level for their own domestic reasons, and so they may also be underplaying the role that was played by the Americans. So this is very much in dispute. You've got one side saying, yes, Mr. Trump deserves a Nobel, the other side saying the Americans had nothing to do with this, and then you saw Mr. Trump's ire. So we've seen 50% tariffs whacked on India, 19% on Pakistan, one of the lowest in Asia. We saw the powerful army chief getting a 2-hour lunch at the White House. Mr. Modi, formerly a friend of Donald Trump, shut out in the cold. India being the only country that has been punished for buying oil from Russia, getting an extra 25% tariffs. And interestingly, while Russia only has 10% tariffs, the lowest level in the world in terms of that. So you could argue this is a sign of Mr. Trump being fairly vindictive when people don't play the game that he wants by nominating him for that prize. But the role that he played, we don't know. What we do know is that the Americans said, we've got a ceasefire deal and we're now going to push for more substantive talks to settle the underlying issues. And those were supposed to start in short order. We've heard nothing more about that. And then, of course, we have heard Donald Trump offering to try and resolve the Kashmir crisis, but it's a very clear position from India that they wouldn't accept outside mediation. So that one's not going anywhere. That conflict would probably have been done anyway after 4 days, because I don't think India wanted to do more than that. But there was American involvement in staying the guns, most likely. But we don't know because it wasn't publicly stated, and it's contended by one of the sides.
I'm going to put a question mark against that one. Adrian Blomfield, thank you very much for your time. That's all we've got time for today.
Thank you so much for having me.
After the break, we go to Thailand to talk about that country's clash with Cambodia. And as Azerbaijan and Armenia look set to end nearly 40 years of conflict, could one of these wars provide Donald Trump with his Peace Prize?
Hey, it's me, Venetia Rainey. We've just released a mini-series about the rise of China's military, and I think you'll really like it. It's a deep dive into the strengths and weaknesses of the People's Liberation Army under leader Xi Jinping, and what it all means for Taiwan. As the US pivots to the Indo-Pacific, understanding China's armed forces has never been more important. You can listen to all 3 episodes now. Just click the link in the show notes or search Battlelines China wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. In July, Thailand and Cambodia went to war over a century-old border dispute. More than 24 people were killed in 4 days of fighting before the sides agreed a ceasefire. Sarah Newey, our global health reporter in Bangkok, told us how much Mr. Trump did to end the violence.
The conflict itself came to an end at the end of July after an unconditional ceasefire was agreed in talks hosted by Malaysia, attended both by the United States and China. While mudslinging has persisted, this ceasefire is holding, and Trump played a key role in bringing it to a head. As the fighting continued, he'd posted statements online threatening to hit both countries with high tariffs. This is something neither economy could really afford. He also said he spoke to leaders from both countries, reiterating his point. After these talks in Malaysia, politicians from both Thailand and Cambodia did say his intervention had been critical, and Armenia even nominated Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Although how much of this is politicking is hard to say, but both countries did agree trade deals with the US, and analysts here in Bangkok have said that Trump's decision to intervene likely did play a significant role in ensuring that both sides at least came to the negotiating table when they did. That said, has the conflict been truly resolved? A more complicated question. Nationalist fervour is still really high in both countries. For instance, here in Bangkok, there's been a notable surge in buildings and digital screens lighting up with the Thai flag across the capital. But for now, the ceasefire is holding, even though most people call it shaky, as both sides have continued to accuse other of violations and many of the underlying issues are still not resolved.
Sarah Newey in Bangkok there. Lastly, one of the big ones. Azerbaijan and Armenia have been locked in conflict for nearly 40 years. In that time, they've seen several outbreaks of full-scale war, massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities that have poisoned relations between the two Caucasus neighbours for generations. But earlier this month, Azerbaijan's Ilham Aliyev and Armenia's Nikol Pashinyan met Donald Trump in the White House to agree a truce. The two countries published the text of a US-brokered peace agreement last week, pledging to respect each other's territorial integrity and formally put an end to nearly 4 decades of conflict. If it were to hold, it could be a truly historic moment. So is this the deal that could win Mr. Trump his coveted prize? Here's James Kilner, an expert in the Caucasus and a foreign correspondent who's frequently reported from there.
I would say that Trump's role was very important. Not in the sense that he led the negotiations particularly. He didn't. The negotiations for peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia had been going on for a long time. They were thorny, they were difficult, but they pretty much got over the line. There was one big hurdle, which I'll come around to, which Trump played a very important role in securing. But the wider conditions for this peace deal had already been created. And some of these conditions actually flows back to the war in Ukraine and Azerbaijan's fallout with Russia, which started on Christmas Day last year when Russian air defense systems shot down an Azerbaijani airline over Chechnya, eventually crashed in Kazakhstan with 36 people killed. And then a complete meltdown of what had been a very strong bilateral relationship between Azerbaijan and Russia. Tit-for-tat spy accusations, arrested journalists, roughing up of IT workers, Russian IT workers in Azerbaijan, etc. Really pushed Azerbaijan to the west and allowed Trump to make this peace deal, allowed him to host Nikol Pashinyan, the Armenian Prime Minister, and Ilham Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, in the White House and preside over this deal, which is remarkable in itself. So to row back slightly for your listeners, this conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia has been rolling on since the late 80s. It's a hangover from the collapse of the Soviet Union. Essentially, the fighting coalesced around Nagorno-Karabakh, although there was bits around the fringes as well. Nagorno-Karabakh was claimed by both sides. It was majority populated by ethnic Armenians, but was placed inside sovereign Azerbaijan by Soviet Union. The point here is that Azerbaijani forces basically won this war in the 1990s and solidified their control over Nagorno-Karabakh. So that was the status quo for a couple of decades. Meanwhile, in the background, Ilham Aliyev, the current president, son of Haydar Aliyev, who was his predecessor, was working behind the scenes to build up his military with his oil wealth, etc., oil and gas wealth, and he was also building up military alliances with Turkey and Israel. These were critically important when he launched a major war, which lasted, I think, 46 days in 2020, summer 2020. And he had drones from Turkey. It was one of the first wars where you can really say drones were really influential. It was incredibly interesting. And I remember writing afterwards how British military and other Western militaries were studying this war for the impact of the drones. Now, we consider drone warfare with the Ukraine war completely standard. Back then it wasn't. Anyway, with Turkish drones and Israeli military intelligence and kit, Azerbaijan in 2020 recaptured a lot of Nagorno-Karabakh. 3 years later, 2023, after toing and froing, the Azerbaijani military went back in and captured pretty much the rest of it. Since then, there have been negotiations between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This was the Kremlin's backyard, so to speak. They were playing a role in it. Slightly sidelined by the war in Ukraine and Armenian distrust after Russian forces apparently stood aside to allow Azerbaijan's attack of 2023 to go ahead. Anyway, that all aside, fast forward to this year, we've had a total collapse in Azerbaijan-Russian relations. This allowed the West really to come in and seal this deal, get this deal over the border. And it came down to Trump. What I mean it came down to Trump is that one of the final sticking points for this war was control of something called the Zangezur Corridor, which was a strip of roads which Azerbaijan was insisting on to link Azerbaijan mainland with an exclave called Nakhchivan, the other side of Armenia. The corridor was about 40 odd kilometers long, and it runs through Armenia, parallel with its border with Iran. So a very geopolitically sensitive piece of road. Before the fallout with Russia, before Azerbaijan's fallout with Russia and Russia's marginalization in the region, you could well foresee Russian forces controlling this bit of road. That became a no-goer. So then people were talking about the UN or the EU controlling this bit of road. But, none of it was quite sticking. It was too complicated. That's where the Trump factor comes in. This bit of road is now going to be controlled by US forces. It's going to rename the Trump Path. This apparently suited both Azerbaijan and Armenia. The deal is done. Trump claims another peace deal, and the US gets control of a seriously vital piece of political real estate in the South Caucasus, the Kremlin's backyard.
James Kilner there on peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Well, you've heard the evidence. I'll leave it to our listeners to make their own judgment about Mr. Trump's peacemaking record and his eligibility for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a long weekend this week in the UK. Venetia will be here on Monday with a bank holiday special interview with the NATO futurist Gabriele Rizzo. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph created by David Knowles. If you appreciated this show, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign on to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine, for latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. This episode of Battle Lines was hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and produced by Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.